Welcome to Crisis Management. I'm Alicia Sikirska. On today's episode, companies across North America are grappling with supply chain issues that are slowing down production, leaving shelves empty, and inventories low. We'll do a deep dive on what's happening with supply chains, what happens next, and how it might impact Canadians. And you may have noticed that the cost of food is going up in recent months. We'll take a look at a new report about food inflation and how Canadians are coping with rising grocery bills. Now, to get through all this, I am joined once again by Sean Speer. Sean is a fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum, and he served as a senior economic advisor for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's here to help us dig through the policy issues brought forward by COVID-19. Sean, it's great to have you back. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks as always.
So I wanted to kick things off by talking about supply chain issues. It's something that first came to light when COVID-19 hit back in March of 2020 and economies around the world went into lockdown. And it's an issue that is making a big comeback even as economies reopen. It's also impacting consumers. I want to take you through a few examples here. Costco announced last week that it is having to deal with port delays, COVID-19 disruptions, and truck driver shortages, meaning that it's been harder to get certain items on shelves. It's also forcing the company to introduce purchase limits on certain items like toilet paper and cleaning supplies, the items that were flying off the shelves last year. Nike is also dealing with a production slowdown. It lost 10 weeks of production in Vietnam, where more than half of all of its footwear is produced. And it's also taking longer to get those goods to market, from 40 days to 80 days because of things like port congestion. So Nike is warning that inventory issues are going to probably happen through the holiday season. The toy industry is also urging customers to get their holiday shopping done early this year because they expect to run into similar supply chain issues ahead of that busy season. There are many more examples like this. So let's dig into supply chain issues. Sean, first, some expected these issues to be resolved once economies reopened and we kind of had the worst of COVID behind us, but we're clearly still seeing these issues today. What do you make of that fact?
I think that's a great question to lead off with. I suspect many viewers are a bit surprised that these issues continue to persist through the pandemic, and in fact, in some areas, as you've outlined, have actually worsened. It made sense initially, of course, when so many countries around the world, shut down their economies and shut down production. But the fact that 20 months on, even as most economies have opened up at least partially, these issues continue to persist. I think is a sign of a couple of things. The first is that our supply chains are less resilient than we thought they were prior to the pandemic. There was such a focus for several years in various sectors around driving efficiencies through global supply chains. I think this whole experience has, I think, no doubt placed the question of resiliency as important or even more important than efficiency. So I think going forward, we'll probably see a more regionalized focus when it comes to supply chains, more resiliency, redundancy rather, built into supply chain needs. I do think that one of the major outcomes of this pandemic will be major rethinking around supply chains more generally. And then the second point I would make is you asked, why are these issues persisting? I think part of it is just the uncertainty that continues to loom over the global economy as we continue to be in this fourth wave, and we see various countries still struggling to get the pandemic or the virus rather under control. I think it's led to companies around the world sort of hedging when it comes to returning to full production on various goods, and so that uncertainty, as we've discussed on previous episodes of this show, I think is a major factor, not just in the supply chain challenges, but on the kind of economy not operating at kind of full level when it comes to investment, employment, various other manifesting itself in various other ways.
You're certainly seeing that production has not returned, even as economies have fully reopened because of that uncertainty. But I do want to talk a little bit more about that resiliency you mentioned, and this drive over the past several decades to make our supply chains more efficient. I think of something like the Toyota's on-time manufacturing model. That was something in the automotive industry in particular that was the model for success, where you don't actually stock up a ton of goods for production. You're making things so that they can be out the door. And it makes the whole system more efficient. But when you run into issues, it creates these downward effects. And we're seeing a lot of that. So do you think that this drive for efficiency in our supply chains has perhaps gone too far, or is no longer the best model given all the uncertainty?
I think the short answer is yes, particularly in certain products, right? I mean, the disruption when it comes to Nike sneakers, isn't good news for Nike, but it's not necessarily going to have major kind of economic or national security implications. But I do think going forward, countries are going to, and governments are going to place a much greater emphasis around redundancy, resiliency, and kind of regionalization of supply chains in goods and services that have major economic or national security implications. One of the biggest ones that viewers will be familiar with is the ongoing supply shortage of semiconductors, which have major economic consequences and major national security consequences because they're a dual purpose input. They have economic purposes, but they also have military or defense purposes as well. So that's a great example, Alicia, where I think the drive towards efficiency has probably reached its limit, and we'll see a kind of overcorrection, at least in specific areas where the risks of these kind of supply chains issues have major economic disruption, or as I say, actually come to touch on national security implications.
So what does this mean for businesses? What should they be doing now? Does it mean you develop alternative sourcing options, or team up with suppliers that are more reliable? How do you begin to add that resiliency back into supply chains?
Well, you asked about businesses, so I'll answer that directly, and then we can talk a bit about government and public policy as well. But as for businesses, I think you're going to want to try to shorten those supply chains, move in a more kind of regionalized direction, so you're less dependent on far-flung sources that can be tied up in some of the transportation issues that we're seeing at ports around the world. As for public policy, it seems to me, Alicia, this is a huge opportunity for Canada to partner with peer jurisdictions. I'm thinking particularly the United States and Mexico to try to build a kind of continental capacity, as I say, particularly in products that touch on that are kind of foundational to the economy or have national security implications. If I was advising Mr. Trudeau, I would be putting this near the top of my agenda in engaging the Biden White House. I think we've seen in recent weeks and months the Biden administration take a pretty strong line vis-a-vis China, and that has obvious implications for supply chains, for two-way trade between the U.S. and China, particularly in some of these major industrial capabilities or technologies. And I would be saying if I was Mr. Trudeau, saying, let's partner on an electric vehicle supply chain where we have both the production capacity and the major input capacity here within North America. And I would be applying that kind of thinking across other parts of the economy, and then using public policy to incentivize businesses to bring some of that production, to bring some of those supply chains out of jurisdictions like China and back into Canada or North America more generally. So I think there's a role for business and for government to improve resiliency, redundancy, and then this kind of regionalization of supply chains.
And in the interim, what do you see this impact being on the consumer? How is this going to impact everyday Canadians, I guess, even going into the holiday shopping season?
Well, it sounds like unless something changes, there will be various areas where there's just supply shortages, and so that will contribute to the inflationary pressures that we've been seeing kind of month over month in recent periods, and it will be a disruption for consumers, as you mentioned, in a various consumer products, including apparel, toys, and so on. Maybe just one area, though, where Canada may kind of counterintuitively benefit from some of these supply shortage issues is in oil prices. Viewers will know that deflated oil prices has put downward pressure on the Alberta economy, including government revenues for several years now. We're now seeing, for the first time in a long time, projections of oil prices rising to $80 per barrel, which has been a level we haven't seen in some time, and that's a function of some of these broader supply issues. So all this to say, well, it will be disruptive and frustrating and even problematic in certain sectors and certain supply issues. When it comes to the upward pressure on oil prices, it's as an oil exporting country, this is one area where these supply issues could be positive for Canada generally, but particularly for the province of Alberta, which is, as viewers know, have had such a tough go of it for the past several years.
Certainly would be some good news for Alberta, some much needed good news for that economy. Another sector of the economy that is not immune to supply chain issues either is our food industry. Food prices continue to surge in Canada, prompting many Canadians to change their behaviors when they are shopping for groceries. A new survey conducted by Dalhousie University's Agri-Food Analytics Lab found that Canada's food inflation rate is close to 5%, with many staple categories such as meat and dairy increasing due to said supply chain issues, as well as labor shortages and difficult weather conditions. Now, Canadians have taken notice and have changed the way that they are shopping. Here is what the survey found. Nearly half of Canadians have reduced meat purchases, and more are using weekly flyers and coupons, as well as buying discounted items. 38% are buying private label brands, so those in-house brands, which tend to be cheaper than the name brands you see in grocery stores. Now, Sean, the rising cost of food is clearly a concerning issue to many Canadians, one we heard a lot about in the recent election. Is this something policymakers should be responding to, or how can they respond to this?
That's an interesting question. I would say, and this is sort of intuitive, but it's worth just stating clearly that rising food prices are inherently regressive. That is to say, low-income households spend a disproportionate share of their income on basic necessities like food. And so if we do indeed see rising food prices as outlined in your recent story at Yahoo Finance, that is going to bite low-income households more than higher income households. And so the question is there a kind of public policy problem here? Is there something the government should be doing to minimize the burden on low income households? I would say it's probably too early to make that judgment now, Alicia. I think we want to see does this problem persist? But I think if it does, yeah, it may be something that government needs to react to, and that could come mostly in the form of boosting pre-existing benefit payments that target low-income households. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the guaranteed income supplement for low-income seniors, or the Canada Workers Benefit, which provides financial support to the working poor, or even the Canada Child Benefit, which of course provides support to low-income families with children. So I guess that's a long way of saying, if I was advising the Minister of Finance, I wouldn't be pulling the trigger now. But if we continue to see rising food prices, which disproportionately burden those low-income households, the government may want to boost supports to those particular households to kind of minimize the effect on them and their household finances.
This idea of inflation and the different industries that it is impacting, as I mentioned, was such a huge issue in the election. So I mean, we are only 9 months into the year, so that it remains to be seen whether this is all transitory or not. That is a big debate that people are having in the finance world. But it's just that in general, something that the government is going to have to keep an eye on, and then potentially adjust policies, as you mentioned, going forward if it is around.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two aspects to this, isn't there? There's the supply issues that we've talked about on today's program, and then there is the kind of monetary policy issue that we've discussed on previous episodes. Viewers may know that that one of the first decisions that this incoming government will make in the next several months is the renewal of the Bank of Canada's inflation target framework, in effect to decide whether to keep the goal of monetary policy focused on 2% inflation target, or whether to add into that mandate other concerns around full employment or household debt or whatever. It seems to me that one of the main inputs into that decision, taken ultimately by the finance minister, who we now know will be Chrystia Freeland, based on recent comments from the Prime Minister, I think will be, how do we ensure that these inflation issues that we've been discussing are indeed transitory and don't become structural? And so I think we've discussed previously that the renewal of the inflation target framework is a kind of sleeper issue that probably doesn't get kind of sufficient attention, given the broad-based economic consequences of the Bank of Canada's monetary policy.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to see what happens next once the cabinet is in place and once that mandate is renewed. Sean, there was another survey that came out this week that I wanted to discuss. This one from Equifax Canada, looking at how small businesses feel about the COVID-19 pandemic recovery. 68% of Canadian small business owners feel confident that their business will recover in 2022. But despite that confidence, many report feeling unsupported by both banks and government. Of the 300 small businesses that were surveyed for this report, 52% they said they have felt not supported by banks, and another 62% said they did not feel supported by the government. Sean, what do you make of these results and the fact that most businesses are confident they'll recover next year, but still feel like the banks and the government have fallen short of providing what's needed for these small businesses through this difficult time?
The interesting about this survey, Alicia, is it seems to me that the question of support can be interpreted in different ways. I think it is fair to say that when it comes to direct financial support, that the Canadian government has been pretty generous when it comes to injecting much needed capital into small businesses during the pandemic, including, of course, at the peak of the public health restrictions. We saw between the wage subsidy and small business loans and kind of other financial instruments, pretty significant support. It seems to me that what this survey is telling us, though, is that it's in non-financial areas where small businesses are feeling let down. The kind of yo-yo effect of lockdowns being wound down and then ratcheted back up just as businesses were making investments to try to make their places of business safe for consumers is a good example where I think businesses are kind of deservedly pissed off. I heard a story anecdotally last week about how Jack Astor's, the popular restaurant, they had made major investments to try to make their establishment safe and reliable for consumers. And just as those investments were coming to completion, they were faced with another round of lockdowns, and they sent the Ontario government a bill for the beer that went unconsumed as a result of those choices. So I think that reflects this kind of general frustration that, governments have been reliable when it comes to direct financial support. The kind of lack of uncertainty and this yo-yoing of restrictions and then wind down and then restrictions again is indeed a source of frustration, and one can sympathize with those business owners and entrepreneurs.
I definitely think that explains that gap between the difference in between banks and government and how these businesses feel about how those two institutions have supported them. But one thing, I mean, we have discussed this before, and you just mentioned it, that the government has, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, provided a lot of support and made that support as kind of broad as possible to catch as many businesses and people that were struggling to make sure that they still qualified for these programs. And then the argument has been made that this has potentially been, and certainly has been given the lockdowns they were facing, propping up some businesses that perhaps would not have survived without that assistance. And so now that we're at this point where economies are reopening, businesses are feeling confident, and these supports are set to expire at some point. Are we going to start seeing some more businesses fail? Is this the time? Like, is this something that just is, you know, an inevitability that it's going to happen?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Alicia. I mean, maybe just to kind of go back to first principles for a second, we have a market economy, and companies grow or fail according to market forces. And, you know, generally speaking, governments don't intervene to interfere in that process. The reason, of course, government did in the context of the pandemic is businesses were struggling not because of choices that they had made, but because of government edicts, which were an appropriate response to an air-based pandemic, a virus. So, you know, there was a good argument for governments to intervene to minimize the burden of those public health restrictions on businesses who were struggling through no fault of their own. The question, I guess, as you put it, is at what point should government start withdrawing that support? You know, and in fact, at what point has government met its obligations to businesses and should resume letting the market determine whether businesses succeed or fail? And I think we're approaching that. You know, I think we want to. There's going to be some rationalization and consolidation in the market, and that would be natural, you know, irrespective of whether we were still in the throes of a pandemic. And one of the challenges with the broad-based level of support is it's not been able to distinguish between businesses that are struggling for market reasons and businesses that are struggling because of the pandemic and the public health restrictions. So by starting to wind down that support, I think we'll enable the market to do what markets do. And yes, indeed, we'll see some rationalization and consolidation, and that will be hard for the affected businesses and their workers. But you know, that's market capitalism, and you know, that's the kind of economy that we need to have in order to incentivize investment and reward entrepreneurs and businesses that are producing goods or providing services that people want.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sean, as you mentioned, part of the reason why some of these businesses are calling on for more support from the government in recent days is because of the increased costs associated with different measures that have been introduced, even vaccine passports. Now, in Ontario, the vaccine passport system has been around for a week now, but hundreds of businesses are defying the system and refusing to check customer vaccine receipts. It's according to reporting in the Toronto Star. Businesses in Ontario that don't comply with the vaccine passport system can face tickets of $1,000 or penalties of up to $10 million. Now, some businesses say the rules are come at a disadvantage for them at a time when they desperately need revenue, and so they are fine with taking the risk of getting fined. There's also been a social media account popped up listing businesses that are defying the order. Sean, it feels like it was somewhat inevitable that we would get to this point where businesses were not complying with this order. I mean, what should the province do in this situation?
It's such a tough situation. It's something we've talked about on this program before, just the kind of sense of division and attenuation that's occurring in our society and the difficult choices that this vaccine debate is imposing on individuals, on households, you know, in this case, retailers and restaurants and so on. I mean, it seems to me, for better or for worse, vaccine passports are a tool to help us distinguish between those who are vaccinated and those who aren't vaccinated, for the purposes of enabling us to reopen our economy and broader society, even with the persistent share of the population resisting getting vaccinated. But those passports will only be as effective as businesses and others abiding by them. And so it seems to me the vast majority of businesses have moved ahead to comply with the vaccine passport system. I hope that this isolated case doesn't become a bigger issue. But I just think at some level, Alicia, I worry about the kind of tension and division that these issues are creating in our society. And so you just hope that those who've resisted vaccination, for various reasons, will start to recognize the cost that not just they're imposing on themselves, but on the rest of society. I know that's a bit of may sound a bit naive, but I'm afraid I just don't have a better answer on what is a really difficult issue. And I can sympathize with businesses. As you said, these are businesses that have been struggling for some time, and the prospect of them turning away paying customers, is difficult. But there's no other way out of this bloody pandemic if we're not going to introduce these type and comply with these types of measures. And so I hope ultimately cooler heads prevail.
Now, there is another aspect of this, of vaccinations and mandating vaccines that I want to discuss, and that's when it comes to sports leagues. It's that time of year where we're seeing some of our favorite sports return, such as the NHL and the NBA, and how leagues are dealing with players who are choosing to remain unvaccinated has really become a hot topic of conversation. Both the NHL and NBA say about 90% of its players are fully vaccinated, but those are not the players that are making headlines. Several prominent NBA players have spoken out against vaccines, including Canadian Andrew Wiggins and Brooklyn star Kyrie Irving. The NHL also has some players that are unvaccinated, but because the league did not seek a national interest exemption, those players that are unvaccinated will not be able to enter Canada to play without having to quarantine for 2 weeks. The NBA has that exemption. So players that come to play the Toronto Raptors that are unvaccinated will actually be able to hit the court. So Sean, looking at this, I mean, how do you think these leagues should deal with unvaccinated players?
Well, I think there's two ways to think about it. First of all, there's the kind of public relations aspect. And, I think the NHL is probably wise not to pursue an exemption from the vaccination rules, which risks looking a bit entitled, a bit arrogant, a bit sort of outside of the set of rules that the rest of us have to comply with. And given that the NHL has such a concentration of teams in Canada, they may be more attuned or at least more sensitive to the idea that they may look like they're searching for special treatment. You may remember when vaccines started to become broadly available, some of the NHL teams did rush to the front of the line. And I think that's similarly a kind of with the goal of not looking like they want to be treated with some kind of special dispensation. The second thing I'd say is I suspect peer pressure will be pretty powerful, at least when it comes to the NHL. It sounds like most teams, maybe have one or two players who are unvaccinated. A lot, of course, have the entire full roster fully vaccinated. But what's interesting, Alicia, is if those players can't travel to Canada for games, and that starts to be reflected in the team's performance. It seems to me that there'll be a remarkable kind of internal pressure for players to get vaccinated, so that their own choices aren't impacting on the team and the team's prospects for making the playoffs. So in some ways, I think this issue may resolve itself as players kind of police their teammates, given the league is so competitive and missing games, critical mass of games, could be the difference for some teams whether they ultimately make the playoffs or not.
And you have to wonder if that monetary incentive will come into play, because if you're missing those games and not getting paid, that will also potentially push some players to get vaccinated. But Sean, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for the fascinating conversation as always.
Thank you, Alicia.
Now, if you want to rewatch this episode or get more news about the coronavirus pandemic, please check out the Yahoo Finance Canada website. And for more bonus content, please make sure you check out our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you have any feedback about the show, please email me. I'm at alicia@yahoofinance.com. Thanks for watching.